Just give me a countdown and we'll go.
All right. Ready in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So good morning. I'd like to welcome those watching at home to the June 28th school committee meeting at the Parkhurst School. It's a couple of minutes after 10 o'clock in the morning, calling the meeting to order. We do have, due to some travel circumstances, a member of the committee who's not physically with us today but is permitted to call in and participate remotely. Ms. Marchant is calling in and on the line with us here at the head of the table. As we move through the agenda today, any action items, because Zena's not physically with us, will require a roll call vote. And I will also just say, Zena, if at any time you're having a hard time hearing any members talk or ask questions around the table, please speak up and we'll move the phone closer to them so you can sort of pick up the full conversation. So very quickly, we do have public comment. I don't see anyone in the audience tonight, or excuse me, this morning, reflexive. Under reports and discussion items, excuse me, we're going to have a kind of a general overview discussion of our capital planning process, particularly for a couple of our new members, talk about kind of what our practices and procedures are in timing and how that kind of plugs into the broader townwide capital planning committee and its work that it does over the summer. And then we will pivot to another kind of introductory discussion about FY20 budget development, long-term budget planning, and some really conversations that have been happening really across the town. And then under action items, we have a couple of minutes to approve today. There is a requirement we declare some surplus property that I believe is here at Parkhurst. And then we will hear from, I think, Ellen to talk a little more about the last round of FY18 budget transfers to balance some columns, and we'll need to vote on those. Chair report, superintendent report, and if anybody has any suggestions for future agenda items, we'll pick that up, and we have another meeting on July 10th. So having run through that, I do not see literally anyone in the audience, so we will skip public comment.
Excuse
and
me,
perhaps...
Chris, are we okay with Ellen all the way down? Should we move her up?
Yeah,
And just like,
Zena may be able to hear you better.
Okay.
yeah, that's what
Well,
I
that's
was
a good idea.
Good idea.
So, Judy, if you shall I maybe just kick this off? I thought we might kind of tag team this a little bit. I will. Yeah.
Point of order.
Yes, please.
I think because there's a member participating remotely, we all have to sort of say that we're here and be sure she can hear us. Rita reminded me.
Okay.
So. Hi, Zena. I didn't hear Susan. Hi, Zena. It's Susan. I'll try to talk louder.
Hi, Zena. This is Brian.
Hi, Zena. Hi, Zena. Michelle's here.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Zena. Ellen's here.
Hi, Ellen.
Okay.
And again, Zena, if as we get into this, if somebody's hard to hear, just speak up and let me know. Okay, so just a very quick background that I would share. So as I think the committee members are aware, we have an appointed representative to the town's capital planning committee. That committee is really kind of gets busy in July reviewing the departmental requests. So that would be schools, it would be fire, police, DPW, there are water and sewer requests, there are engineering requests that come in. These are typically presented by police chief, fire chief, director DPW, and on the school side, either the superintendent and or the director of finance. The requests that come in are not sort of explicitly for the following fiscal year, although that's certainly what the capital planning committee tends to be focused on. These department heads usually come in with a 4 or 5 year outlook, which is very helpful to the committee. And then basically with each department head coming in and presenting their priorities, the capital planning committee meets with them in July and kind of early August, and then may request some department heads come back in for some follow-up discussion. The challenge for the capital planning committee is always that there are more requests than there is funding. The two sources of funding for capital are the building and capital stabilization funds. And for anyone who's been watching town meeting, I think Ms. Filio, who's the chair, has been saying pretty consistently for the past 6 or 7 years, we have dwindling resources, we have increasing requests. This is frankly also germane for the next item on our agenda when we talk about FY20 budget planning and kind of the out years. So the Capital Planning Committee, having limited resources, kind of vets all these requests, and then through a process where each committee member votes and they look at the initial pass just to be sure some of these rankings don't seem out of whack, that there wasn't a member who was confused. Then they frankly will kind of identify maybe the top, depending on the year. It could be the top 5 or 6 items in one fund. It could be the top 10 or 12. It depends how expensive these requests are, and again, what the resources are. The other sort of risk to this is we are actually always dependent on an affirmative vote of town meeting to reallocate retiring debt back into these funds, and we've been reminded from time to time there could be a scenario when town meeting actually says no. And again, that's even something that we've talked about for our next agenda item as we look into the out years and kind of a more dire financial model. So, Capital Planning Committee then comes up with some rankings. They vote and actually make a recommendation to the town manager for projects to be funded out of the building and the capital stabilization funds. Some projects are funded in the fall. Historically, it's fair to say, I'm looking to Brian to confirm, I would say more projects are funded in the spring, simply because from a risk management point of view, we know more in the spring about available resources than we do in the fall. That is, if a bridge starts to collapse or something and we need a sort of emergency source of funds. So Capital Planning Committee and Town Meeting has been kind of helpful and supportive in the past, recognizing that major school projects like, let's say, McCall Gymnasium ceiling replacement or McCall Phase 1, work that needs to get done during the summer really can't be funded in the spring in time to get RFPs out, to finish design documents and so forth. So for major, I'll just call it school projects, typically those are presented in the fall, and with town meeting support, then it is shovel ready, if you will, on the first day of summer. So we certainly appreciate that. So having said sort of how that generally works, the practice of the school committee has been to have the capital planning rep and the chair meet with the superintendent and with Ellen to look at kind of our 5-year outlook. Ellen, I believe, has met with the various building principals. Is that right?
We've had some conversations.
Yep. So Ellen, and prior to Ellen, John Denizio, kind of in May, would start visiting the schools just to meet with all the principals, just to say, what do you need? What's broken? What needs to get fixed? And so forth. I'll also say there's a $25,000 threshold for what we call a capital project. So if it costs less than $25,000, the operating assumption is that we find other sources for that. That could be out of DPW maintenance or maybe out of the public schools budget. So at any rate, so after having kind of had an internal meeting, an internal review of our school buildings about what the needs and priorities are, there is some kind of subcommittee discussion about that, if you will, and then that's finally brought forward to the committee in a multi-year outlook, which is a document that we have here at the table. And then we would look to the superintendent, director of finance, and our capital rep just to kind of walk through these and explain them to the school committee, again, with kind of particular focus on maybe the next and the following fiscal year, maybe less so in the out years, but at least to understand what the priorities are. Then after having had an opportunity to hear this, ask questions, then at a following meeting, we'll actually get a ranking sheet. Each member would rank these projects offline, send in their rankings to Ellen. She puts them together. She brings that information back then to a school committee meeting where we see kind of where everything fell out. We see what the priorities are. And ultimately, we would vote on this towards the end of July on our priorities. That's what gets presented to the Capital Planning Committee, and then literally just through the rest of the summer, it gets kind of digested with that committee with all the other department needs. And we would find out kind of in August. Brian, is that about right?
It's been moving later recently because of so many requests and other things.
So
early September, really.
So let's say late August, early September, Zena, is really kind of when the committee is up against a deadline, because what's driving this is fall town meeting. So we have to know what it is we're going to ask for well enough in advance of fall town meeting to begin to prepare that information. And then at the same time, the capital planning committee prepares a report to town meeting in the fall that also identifies the projects that we anticipate in the spring. So a perfect example of that is the carriage house schematic design. Is something that the capital planning committee voted in late August or early September, even though it was slated for a spring vote. So I mean, that's like a mouthful of the process, but can I maybe ask Brian just to weigh in? Did I miss anything kind of on the broader capital side that maybe is kind of relevant to this for everybody's understanding?
Two things I'd add is one, in addition to the two stabilization funds, the town meeting has typically provided free cash towards capital projects in the amount of $220,000. That has been relied upon by the capital planning committee for a number of years. It is a lot of money. It might not seem like a lot of money in the broader scheme, but it actually is important for one or more projects to be funded. So that's one thing. Second is a number of the projects that come forward, even from the schools, but from other places, have values far in excess of what the capital building stabilization funds and free cash are available. For instance, just looking at our sheet right here, I see some that are $3-4 million, which is well in excess. So it has not, in the past, the capital planning committee has recommended debt service from those funds to fund larger projects. But because of the lack of available funds, capital planning committee is no longer or has not been recommending using those for debt service. So a project that is, say, $3 million in effect is unfundable through the current capital process and would have to go to town meeting for free cash or general borrowing. I think it's important when we look at projects, we see a number of projects, anything that's over about $1.4 million, $1.5 million, maybe 1.6 would tap out all of the available funds, so therefore it actually currently would not be funded through capital. So I think those are just two important points to make.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the best example of how the committee has had to think creatively to stretch, although it impacts other requests, is that our fire and police department need to replace all their radios because they're losing frequencies in the next few years. They're going to be grabbed by the federal government. And so we can all agree it's good for police and fire to have radios, and we'd like to do that, in one fiscal year, but we just don't have the resources for it. So we're having to stretch that out over 4 years to make that work. And we're doing that. So that's kind of a very broad overview. Judy, what do you or Ellen have anything you want to offer just about the process maybe before we pivot to Ellen to talk through some of these, having discussed this with committees?
Sure. So the process that's been used in the past that I kind of inherited was that, as Chris said, a smaller group would put together a list of considerations for the next fiscal year, and then a rating sheet would be distributed to members, and members would be asked to prioritize that list. Where John and I sometimes found that process to be less helpful is we didn't always get the rating sheets from every member. And then we were left with kind of doing averages of the ratings and trying to summarize that in some way. It doesn't seem to be, particularly since these projects vary widely in cost, and where you might place your priority if you knew you had X number of dollars available may be different than otherwise. I'm not sure those sending out to members for rating sheets was always the most helpful way. An average of the member ratings was not a helpful way for us to make decisions, I felt. So I asked Chris if we could reconsider that and perhaps just attempt to reach consensus about the priority list as opposed to having individual members vote on a priority list. Unless we have widely divergent opinions about it, then we can find some other way to do it. But just sort of that numerical average of the ratings that people gave it always kind of regressed to everything was a 3.
Right.
Because only 5 members, not everyone always votes. So that process has been not as helpful. So my suggestion was go straight to discussion, consensus, and try to reach agreement on what would be submitted to the capital planning committee. The request comes in for our submission earlier than we're really able to do it given summer meetings and people's schedules. So I have let Mr. Toogood know that it's going to be later in July for the school department priorities to be submitted, and he seems to be fine with that. So my suggestion is not to sort of send out the rating sheets as we've done in the past, but to discuss the proposed projects and reach consensus on priority with the full group. But it's the committee's decision about whether you want to continue with the past process or not.
Can I ask you a question about how the process would work? Since it's all new to me. Would the subcommittee propose a rank order, and then that would be the basis of the discussion? The only reason I say that is it feels like it would be very hard for
Yeah.
us to sit down and, as a committee, sort of work through this. It could take 3 hours to say which. So we'd have to start with some presumptive order, and then have the committee then discuss. Well, no, I think the one should be 2, or one should be 3.
Right.
Or whatever.
I think the purpose of the ranking is to give the capital planning committee a signal about what the school committee thinks is most important. And so there are lots of caveats with that. We think these 3 are the most important unless the SOI gets approved by the MSBA, lots of acronyms here. Unless the Lynch or Morocco project were to be approved, then some things would fall off.
Right.
So capital planning committee knows that, and we always go and speak with them in any case. So I'm less concerned with that. I think it is always good to start with a draft list, work from a draft that says, either Ellen and I or the subcommittee and Ellen and I think this should be the order, and then we can move things around as we have a discussion.
If I can just follow up for 2 seconds. As a former and now new member of the Capital Planning Committee.
Brian, speak up a little bit.
Yes.
Want to move the phone
As
closer?
a former and now, again, new member of the Capital Planning Committee, we rely heavily on the recommendations from the department heads, so that when the fire or schools tells us this is our rank order, we actually rarely go out of order of what they've proposed. So I think it's very important that we actually, that order actually means what we want, because it'd be rare that we would say, no, the fire department says they need a new fire truck, but we really think that this is what they need. So we need to be extraordinarily careful, this committee here, that we rank them and don't say, well, they know that if X or Y happens, because they're going to go on that rank list and they're going to say, you think that X is the most important. That's our number one. That might be the only thing gets funded for the schools this year. So
Right.
I think it's very important.
I agree.
So Zena, can I ask you a question? Excuse me, Zena, do you have any documents in front of you? Do you have like this 5-year capital summary update from Ellen?
Yeah, I have that with you.
Oh, good.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I ask it? You and Brian referred to a subcommittee of our committee, and I was not aware of our formal subcommittee.
So
Is it a formal capital subcommittee?
No, it's more like we call it maybe like an ad hoc committee of the superintendent. It's not a subcommittee like we have for a curriculum or finance.
So I think, Zena, if I could jump in, generally there's been one member of the school committee who's been the representative to the capital planning,
And that's Brian.
and that's Brian now. And so typically it would be Brian, John, and myself would be the subcommittee. And in the transition, I think Chris has been the representative, and so kind of handing that responsibility off. So there's just been a working group, it's not really a subcommittee.
So now this working group is Judy, Brian, and Ellen?
That would be the working group, yes.
Okay. And so you guys came up with this spreadsheet?
Not well. So that's a great question. The spreadsheet, Zena, kind of gets tweaked year to year. So let's say there's a number of things in the FY20 column that last year were in the FY19 column. So things that actually get funded, few and far between, they get dropped off the list. Things that don't get funded just get pushed out. So this isn't really sort of created out of the ether. There's so I call it kind of like a legacy document. And by the way, as you move towards the right, you'll see there's less and less information. In fact, there's nothing out there for FY24. Make no mistake, there will be FY24 projects, and there's chuckling around the table if you can't hear it, Zena, only because, the further you go out, the less you know. But I think, to Judy's point, what will happen with the MSBA for Lynch or Morocco? Will we not make some adjustment in the structural deficit of funding we have in the building and capital stabilization funds? I think over time there's been less and less interest in spending a lot of time and energy to come up with a fully flushed out spreadsheet when the resources are so meager, as Brian was saying, you may only get like one project funded. So this is
Right.
really sort of the most urgent needs, and frankly, a lot of this initially comes from the building principals through their conversations with Ellen.
Yes, and with Pete as well.
And with- yeah.
DPW and also Meg White at Town Hall.
So would it be appropriate now, since Zena was just asking questions about the projects themselves, if maybe you or Ellen could walk through what these are, like for FY 2021? Michelle, do you have a question?
I just want to make sure that Zena has the current document that we have sitting in front of us.
She said she does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We mailed it to her, yeah.
Okay.
My questions weren't yet down to each project. I was just wondering where the numbers come from and the decisions come from. I'm talking bigger picture.
Yep.
now.
So the numbers, Zena, the DPW the town manages a facilities, how can I describe it? Like a facilities renewal and replacement database. It's, the expression is VFA, that's just a proprietary name for it. DPW and engineering with VFA representatives have toured each municipal building, information on square footage, the building type, building construction type, doesn't it have air conditioning, window type and so forth, the flooring type, and then the age of all these materials. It's actually entered into the database, and so that actually then helps us project, and we'll talk about this more in the next agenda item when we get to it, but that database could tell you, for instance, let me look at the list here. So where it says, Zena, I'm going to go to like second page. I'm going to go to second page, like up at the top, Lynch Domestic Water Heat Distribution, $1.3 million. That was initially coming out of the VFA database. That has since been tweaked a little bit by an engineering study. Look at FY21, that's a bigger one. Lynch window replacement, $3.4 million. So that number, Pete just doesn't sort of make that up, but that comes from the VFA database where they know the number of windows, the type of windows, and it's driven by current market costs and also escalation if it's an out-year project. The same is true for the Lynch gym floor, 350, and so forth. So it comes from a place. But certainly if the committee were to prioritize something and then it actually gets approved by capital planning, then our capital planning's process is we would fund the initial kind of schematic design. So you would actually hire engineers, architects to do some preliminary work, and then you get a better, clearer understanding of the actual cost. Does that make sense?
And what does RDK stand for?
RDK was the engineering firm that did it, so it says per RDK study. Mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineering firm.
So they did a study of our entire district?
No, they did the study of Lynch that's noted up there at the top of page 3. And actually, they did it because this was a priority of the school committee, and the capital planning committee funded the actual engineering study. It was, I don't know, I'm looking at Brian, maybe $90,000 or something, because it's work that needs to be done.
Can I just ask?
Susan has a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or more of a comment, but it seems to be apropos here. This is a 5-year, summary, and when we do our rankings or however we, determine what our priorities are, it's just a priority for next year, right? It's for 1 year. And if you look at some of these, there are 2 entries, like for the McCall replace roof. For FY22, there's one number, 180,000, and then the next year, FY23, there's $1 million. As I understand it, that first number is probably just the design, the cost to design, and figure out how much it's going to cost to actually do the work. And then the larger number is to actually install the new roof. So, when you get into these bigger projects where there's a separate design cost, I think there's some practice or philosophy at the capital planning committee that they sort of don't really want to spend money on a design only if you don't really need the project imminently, or that it's so expensive that we just will never be able to do it. So I think it's important to kind of look at the ones that are really large amounts and have these separate design numbers to sort of, if we really need to do that, we really need to push for something like that, because it's a 2-year kind of cycle to get that done.
That's a good point. And capital does feel that way, although it's not always necessary that the money to actually do the work come from the stabilization fund if there's another source. So McCall Phase 2 is a perfect example where some of that, McCall Phase 1 and Phase 2, some of that early design work was funded by capital, but with the understanding that capital doesn't have the money to actually get the job done. But so long as there is kind of a broader town-wide commitment to it and it needs to happen, they're happy to seed that work, if that makes sense. So we will not, so the purpose, I think, Zena, this morning is we're not necessarily getting into a big debate on the priority of these projects, but it was more intended to be just kind of an overview of the process, kind of explain how we've typically done it. You know, Judy has kind of made the point, maybe we might want to rethink how we do it, but maybe before we come back and revisit that, I think it would be helpful if Ellen, if I could put her on the spot to just perhaps walk through the FY20 stuff for everybody's benefit, and then if there are questions, we could certainly ask questions about those projects. Is that all right?
Certainly.
Let me, hold on, let me pass the phone down so Zena can hear you.
So Ellen, are you going to go out over the whole 5 years? Like if there's no number for one of these items until fiscal '23?
No, I'll
We're not
just
gonna- yeah.
I'll just discuss FY 20 and 21 if that's all
Yeah,
right with the
that
committee.
sounds good.
Okay, so over the course,
Question, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Zena?
She didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry.
The question was, am I going to go through every line item on the list? And I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to discuss items for FY 20 and 21.
Okay.
Okay, so over the course of this school year, Pete Lawson and I have been out and we have visited the buildings, we have walked the buildings together. We have ongoing conversations with the principals about building needs. The facilities direct module he uses for maintenance. I see the work orders that are coming in that are filed for the buildings. And through conversations that we've all had during the school year about what the building needs are, specifically items that are going to cost in excess of $25,000 are reflected on this sheet. Many of them were carried over from last year onto the sheet. There are a few additions this year. But for things for FY 20 and 21, central office and engineering study of the electrical service and branch wiring upgrade of $25,000 for FY 20. This is important because what we discovered with the flood over the winter was that the wiring for the building is original. So the downstairs, anything that was impacted through the flood that went through the walls and the ceilings downstairs, the electrical for the downstairs is being rewired and the panels for the downstairs are being replaced. However, upstairs is not being touched because it was not damaged by the flood. So we do know that the electrical capacity for the building also cannot support having multiple outlets in the buildings, in the offices. When these splits were installed, they did have to, that tapped out the building as far as its electrical capacity. So if we were to look at putting the building back into service as swing space for classrooms, we would need to really take a close look at the electrical needs of the building for classroom space. We also have added for FY 21 a line with the TBD for what the cost would be for the electrical service and branch wiring upgrade.
So in other words, for 20, that we might call that schematic design.
Right, and that's why I wrote on their engineering study.
Yep.
And then the next entry would be for the actual work.
Yep.
We did push the central office for a VoIP phone conversion out to FY 21 for $125,000. Through discussions with the principals being out in the buildings during the course of the year, Pete and I both feel that having $100,000 in FY 20 for district-wide floor carpet replacement and abatement for selected classroom areas would be appropriate, because throughout the district, in Lincoln, Lynch, Morocco, there are classrooms that do have flooring that is just far reached the end of life. McCall, for FY 20, we do have in on the sheet $550,000 for masonry design, restoration, and replacement, with an additional, and I know we were only discussing FY 20 and 21, but I think it's important to note, with an additional $550,000 in FY 22. Through my meetings with Meg White and with Pete Lawson yesterday, Pete was able to provide a copy of a study that Gale and Associates had done back in 2011 regarding the repairs that they had were able to identify at that point in time regarding the conditions at the front entrance facade and portico roof. So they are reaching out to Gail to see if Gail can review the file as well as provide some updated pricing.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure,
Were
certainly.
you done with that one?
Yes.
Are those contingent on each other? That is, if we don't think we'll do the FY '22 work, do we not bother with the FY '20, or are
So
they separate
Can you
work?
just repeat the question for Zena?
Sure. Brian had asked Zena if if the projects were contingent upon each other with, if we didn't get the 550,000 for FY '20, would we be able to go forward with FY '22? Once Meg White has a conversation with Gail regarding what their updated costing would be, I'll be able to provide some more insight into that. They were hoping that they would be able to give a ballpark for an amount to do the entire project.
Okay, thank you.
It's all exterior masonry work.
And is that masonry like original to the building? And
Yes.
so
Much of it
it's
is.
pretty old. Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask who Pete is?
Pete Lawson is the facilities manager for DPW. He manages all of the buildings for the town and for the school department. He works with me pretty much on a daily basis regarding concerns with the buildings, as well as each of the buildings has a head custodian that reports to Pete.
Okay.
All right, so Pete's in the buildings pretty much on a daily basis. Lincoln, the playfield drainage and site renovation work for $93,000. That has been on the capital list for some time, and that is it is an item that really would be helpful to have that completed. As well as the Lincoln playfield turf being done in '21 after the drainage and site renovation work is done. Lincoln is also in need of some exterior masonry repairs at this time. Pete and I met and discussed that, and that is $50,000 was what Pete has identified. On the second page, on the top, we have the Lynch domestic water and heat distribution replacement. This includes the boiler, piping, and water distribution. And this is per the RDK study, and that was $1.3 million. With the Lynch heating system, this heating system, the boiler is between 20 and 25 years old. It is a gas steam unit. The piping in the building is original to the building, and the building dates back to
1960. And I was also just going to add, there are two boilers in the
Okay.
building. The backup boiler is actually original to the building.
Okay.
So the newer boiler, I think, is 1983, 1984 or something.
The new.
The new one is that old, yes.
Well, more than 20-something years old.
Yes.
That's more like 30
Yeah.
something.
Okay.
Makes me feel old.
So when we had discussed the RDK study, the number of $1.3 million had been determined. Lynch and Morocco, we combined the design spec phase for both of them into one line for $150,000. And then we do have Lynch replacement in FY '21 for $3.4 million. It is important to note that the number for Lynch is higher than the number for Morocco for the window replacement, because Morocco did see window replacement a few years back. Then we have for Lynch, we added this item for FY '20, the Lynch cafeteria floor and ceiling abatement and replacement. At this time, there is some tiles in the cafeteria that are crumbling, and that is a concern regarding asbestos, as well as the ceiling is the popcorn ceiling, and that would be a significant exposure should there be a pipe break or something happen with the ceiling structure. That was a concern of DPW's.
Can I make one clarification on the
Sure.
window project?
Sure.
Zena, for your benefit, the Morocco school had just a partial window replacement maybe 7 or 8 years ago along the kindergarten classrooms and one first grade classroom. So I might estimate 15% of the windows at Morocco were picked off. Morocco's also a smaller school, so there are literally just more windows at Lynch. And also what drives that number, Pete's number includes some sill replacement where, because the windows at Lynch are a single pane steel sash, there's been some rotting of the sills as well. whereas sort of the window, the opening in the wall itself at Morocco is not as deteriorated as it is at Lynch. So it's a bigger project. It's also a little more involved in terms of scope.
Can I just ask on the Lynch cafeteria, the ceiling and floors, the 100,000 is to do the whole thing, or is that
That is for the abatement and replacement,
just to do
yes.
it?
Be sure she
Yep.
heard the question.
Oh. Zena, Susan had asked the question if the $100,000 for the Lynch cafeteria floor and ceiling abatement and replacement was in fact for both the abatement and replacement. Peter's estimation would be that the 100,000 would do both.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarification
Sure.
too on that same one? The health and safety concern is the ceiling, not the floor. Is that correct?
The floor right now would be,
The floor is the.
the floors, it would be if we had to pick between the two of them, would be the priority.
Okay.
But however, the ceiling, it would be, if we're doing one for the containment for an abatement, it would make sense to do both at the
I
same
just didn't know if
time.
there was a higher priority of the floor or the ceiling.
Right now, there are tiles that are crumbling, and that's an issue.
Okay.
But however, if we could do both at the same time because of,
Okay.
containment
Like,
and things
One
like that.
containment.
I totally agree. I just wanted to understand,
No.
again, for limited funds, always like to see what can be broken up. It
No.
doesn't sound like that one would break up well, so.
No. For FY '21, the Lynch playground is a concern. Mr. Dupree and I have had many conversations about his playground this year. And resurfacing the playground is a priority for Lynch for $300,000. And then we go down to Morocco, floor and carpet replacement in the building of $300,000. This is, the next item is where we get to, next two items is window replacement. Morocco window replacement part 2 for classrooms for $200,000 for FY '21, and also for FY '21 Morocco window replacement, clerestory and courtyard. We have the replacement of the electrical system for FY '20 for Morocco, and this $100,000 is for the design specs, followed by FY '21 for the replacement of the electrical system. Also in FY '21, $37,500 to replace, to gain the specs for the domestic water and heat piping replacement. And then looking out into FY '22, $212,500 for replacement of the domestic water and heat pipes.
I'll just interject one thing quickly as we turn that page. So the 212.5 would in all practicality be lumped on the next page with, where did we see Morocco?
The sinks
Replacing
and
heating
cabinets?
No mistake, that's
No.
mistake.
Well, there's,
System?
it's not that, yeah, I'm looking for the heating system. That says Mystic. So
Yeah.
I guess what I was going to caution is, excuse me, there may be, that 212,500, that number's just been there for a long time.
Okay, so re-examine.
So, and barring any other information, that's just what we're using. But when we brought in RDK and they did the analysis at Lynch, that
Okay.
number we'd been holding, that number went up because they'd actually gone out and looked at it. So that number may come up. Morocco, unlike Lynch, that has these old inefficient sectional boilers, Morocco has high efficiency gas boilers that are about 7 or 8 years old. But we still have some air handling equipment in the rooms themselves, and you've got the domestic water and water for heat and so forth. A lot of that is under the slab, so that number just may go up.
Helen, can I ask you a
Yes,
question?
certainly.
You had the Morocco floor and carpet replacement for $300,000 fiscal year '20.
Yes.
The previous page, we had district-wide floor, carpet replacement, abatement, selected classrooms. Would I be correct in assuming that the $100,000 for district-wide excludes anything taking place in Morocco?
Correct.
Okay. Now,
Correct.
Can you
if
repeat that?
Brian asked
Just the
if
mic
the
over there.
funding for replacement of carpeting and flooring at Morocco was exclusive of the $100,000 that was listed on the first page for district-wide select flooring replacement and abatement, and that is correct. The funds for Morocco are for Morocco only and are not tied to the $100,000 request for other district-wide flooring and carpeting replacement and abatement.
Can I follow up on that? And I'll try to speak really loudly. So if only the $100,000 for district-wide flooring carpet abatement was able to be funded, and the $300,000 at Morocco was not. Would that then $100,000, are there priority areas in Morocco that you might say, well, with that 100, there's these 3 rooms in Morocco that are now a priority? Okay.
So if I could jump in, Chris, on this
Yeah,
one?
please.
The intent is to have a recurring amount to take care of flooring replacement over a number of years. And there's a lot of pent-up demand, and even in some of the newer schools, there are areas that need to be addressed. And so neither the school department nor DPW has funds to replace or address flooring, particularly if there's abatement. And some of the carpets also need abatement because the mastic that they're put down with. So that's one issue. One thing you don't see on here is typical repair / painting or furniture. And so at some point, I'd like to have a separate discussion about whether we add into our base budget funding, or the DPW adds into their base budget, increased funding to address painting, repair, and replacement of furniture. Because we've been fortunate in that we've had a couple of building projects that have let us reuse old furniture from those buildings in other places. And we try to address, kind of on an emergency basis, walls that need repainting. But I think if we were going to have a planned refurbishment of schools on a regular basis, that some classrooms haven't been painted for many, many, many years. And we have furniture that is in need of replacement as well, significantly in need of replacement. So those are sort of philosophical questions that we would want to discuss as a school committee, and then perhaps discuss with capital. In other districts, folks do it in different ways. One way we've been able to address some furniture replacement or additional furniture needs is through our building rental. And that is a revolving fund that's often used for repairs or equipment or furniture, generally related to spaces that get rented out. And so philosophically, Pete asked to have this placeholder put in for rug and floor, to address rug and floor issues that have that he hasn't been able to get to with his budget. So I just wanted to make sure everyone understood that ask.
And can I just also add that I think for the first 5 years I was on the school committee, we had furniture replacement for $50,000, 50, Zena, every year. And I think the committee as a whole just kind of gave up on that because there was always a roof somewhere that was leaking, or there was a boiler that needed to be replaced. It was something we knew we needed to do. It frankly was relatively low on our list that we submitted to Capital, and by the time Capital was looking at all of their requests and looking at the funding, $50,000 for furniture for the school district never got close to the cutoff. So I think it fell away because they felt like it was sort of a circular exercise. So go ahead, Ellen.
Okay. Thank you. So on the top of page 3, Morocco classroom sink cabinet unit replacement for $100,000. This is to replace the sinks and cabinets in all of the classrooms. It could be done. These sinks and cabinets are in poor condition. Many of them are.
Do you have a number?
For each of the classrooms, I will get that for you.
But I mean,
exactly.
it's like 20 classrooms.
Should be
more.
Classroom total,
Should be 18 or 19.
18 or 19,
Because
okay.
we say Morocco's a 21 building, but
That's
we
what I
have the two
wanted- yeah.
modulars, and this doesn't apply to the modulars.
Okay.
So interestingly enough, one question I asked related to this is, could we just remove some of these units and not replace them? One of the things Pete pointed out to me that I was not aware of is that these sinks fulfill the requirement for drinking water for classrooms, and that there isn't, unlike newer buildings where we built handicapped accessible bubblers into the hallway, drinking fountains. We don't have that capacity, so to add those would be quite expensive, to add the number we need if we take out the sinks. And so in some ways, it's not ideal not to have a sink in an elementary classroom. It's always great to have a sink for a variety of purposes. There's a lot of hands-on activities that happen, cleanup and hygiene. It's great to have a sink. I thought as a temporary measure, could we remove some of the units that are
They're rusting,
in
right?
extreme poor repair? And so the trade-off is it could cost us as much to put in the drinking fountains because because of accessibility, you have to have some that are the right height and so forth. So it is, and if the piping is not there, I would assume it could be an expensive proposition. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I'm trying to look at all options here. And of course, every question you ask has another complicated answer.
Oh, that's good to know. And this has been on the list for quite some time.
4 or 5 years, and they've not only rusted, Susan, but the really parts are virtually not available. They leak. So, DPW staff, their plumbers are called periodically to try to,
Patch it up.
take it apart, patch it up, put it back together, and the leaks contribute to the rotting and the rusting. And frankly, teachers for many years were actually storing classroom materials in the base cabinets, and that's not happening anymore because they get
not
paper
dry.
gets wet, now you got to throw it out. So, yeah, you're right. It's been there for a while.
Right. And this is a project that could be done in phases as well. If it were easier for capital, for this to be funded through capital, that it could be done over the course of a couple of years. And then we go down to Mystic. Mystic is in need of replacing of the heating system in FY21 for $500,000. The Mystic heating system is also, the boiler is a natural gas unit, steam unit. It is in excess of 20 years old. The building dates back to the 1920s, and the piping in the building, according to DPW, is original. And then also for FY21 for Mystic, $75,000 for window replacement.
And do you know, is that like a design number on
design.
replacement, or is that?
I'm pretty confident that number was a design number.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a design number.
So there's no
No.
cost placeholder for
No,
that?
there is not a cost placeholder yet.
And the windows that are there now are already replacement windows, but they look like
Yes.
30-ish, I don't know how old they are. They're not original to the building, but they're old.
And the last thing is the carriage house.
The carriage house renovation, restoration and renovation, $3.1 million in FY20, with an additional $735 in FY22.
So that 3.1 number is from the master plan. I think, not sure what the 735 was, and I can't remember, did we talk about that in our last meeting?
Was the 3.1 for not full fit out?
No, that's the full, that's the
I don't know.
master
I'm
plan
not sure
number.
what-
It's
Remember the
2.8
The
to
735
3.1.
was a remainder.
Is that,
We'll double check what that is.
would that be for parking or the additional,
No,
no?
it,
Okay,
I think it might just be a remainder that was carried over.
yeah,
Okay.
that
That can just be removed.
Yeah.
Okay.
that may be an oversight.
Okay.
And we had also talked about, not that it's on the grid here, but if and when this is to happen, central office moves out of here to the carriage house. Now the building's available. Just to remind folks, we can't lease out the building until we have an elevator. We do have an architect on board who's doing the schematic. Well, actually, they're going to do full construction documents, actually, to put in elevators at both Parkhurst and Mystic. We don't have the money to do the work, but we're getting the drawings completely finished, so we have a very crystal clear idea of what it's going to cost. And it's kind of one of those cross that bridge when we get there moments. We should all be assuming in an elevator for Parkhurst could be $250,000, but we'll know more at the end of the summer. So that might be a conversation, Judy, you could have more with Ellen and Brian about, how do we talk about that or acknowledge that on this list? There are some ADA transition funds that were available to do that study.
And that's,
But also, and so $125,000 each year goes towards that. I know one of the priorities for Meg that the capital group has supported is, because we did our last ADA transition plan about 7 years ago or so, it's time to go back and just do a new survey of the town. So a consultant is going to be hired. They're going to produce a report. We should assume that's going to be somewhere between $40, $50 or more $1,000. So that's got to come out of those resources as well.
so when I met with Meg yesterday, we did talk about the elevators, and she was hoping that the ADA funding would be able to pay for the elevators.
Both or one?
Or I believe the one for here at Parkhurst.
Okay.
So she said as things progress, she will keep
Right.
me in the loop as far as funding.
Okay.
Can I ask one last question about the carriage house renovation restoration
Just loud so she can hear you.
of $3.1 million. That's from the master plan, that 3.1. What does that represent? Is that, I realize it is an estimate from the master plan, but is it, at the time, was that an all-in, or was that just construction? Was that also, what is 3.1 million?
That's all in to accommodate the central office move, so the restoration of the envelope, the gut, interior redesign and construction for the office use. That also includes some additional parking that's shown in the master plan as well. This, though, is and it's not a lot, excuse me, when I say the curb cut, I think parking or curb cut or both that's shown in the master plan. However, this was, I think, like an FY 19 number in the master plan, not 20. I think there was a range. I thought it was like 2.8 to 3.1. 3.1 was the top end. So, and maybe it's important to have that footnote about, what that represents. Obviously, when we move forward with the schematic design, we'll know much more like we did with McCall.
But that would theoretically include the construction documents as well in that 3.1, theoretically?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So it's
I
not
see where you're
total
going, yes.
construction cost estimate?
Well, there's construction cost and project cost.
Right.
Project cost.
So what is this?
This was presumed to be a project cost number,
Okay.
but not for FY 20. So more like FY 19. So there's always,
An
every year we have some
escalation
escalation.
Right.
Right.
What,
So
5
the-
to 7%, something like that?
Right, so, like there were some elements in the master plan that are escalated to 18, and some, I think, might have been 19 for either Lynch or Morocco, because there was an understanding, we're not gonna do 5 projects in 1 year. But, on the other hand, I think there was some agreement, it didn't make sense to take individual project, escalate this one to 20, this one to 22, this one to 24, because we really don't know, what the order is of these projects, because a lot of it has to do with the MSBA.
Okay, thank you.
I want to just go back and clarify one thing on page 1, under Lincoln exterior masonry repairs. I understand there's some issue here around what Pete would call the flat work, so walkways, the knee walls, the steps, where maybe the construction was original construction was poor. Is that kind of what this is? So it's not $50,000 on the building itself, which is what we are looking at McCall.
Right.
Got it.
There were also some steps at McCall to the auditorium that are in need of
Right.
repair.
I wonder if, Ellen, we might just change the description of that to be
Sure.
a little clearer, just so people don't think that's the, building envelope.
Okay.
Because we, did a massive restoration of that building not that long ago.
And none of the McCall repairs or anything that need to be done there will be captured in the,
It's all on the front.
it's all in the front, okay.
Oh, for the project, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
The project's all in the rear.
It's all
This
in
is
the.
all in the front, that's what I was clarifying.
And also, I think part of that conversation she's going to have with Gail, we need to be sure they're going to talk also about just replacing some of that completely rather than repair. So some of the balustrade that's there in the front to protect you from falling into the areaway, that was all precast concrete. You can tell over the years, someone's gone back with a variety of concrete mixes and patches to try to fix it. It literally looks like a patchwork, and so the question should be asked, do we keep trying to chase this, or do we just, take them out and replace them with something new that still, respects the character of the building? That might be a better long-term solution. It may be cheaper, too.
Right.
So thank you for running down that whole list with us.
Thank you.
Because we do have to get on to discussing our multi-year planning next. I would open up, does the committee have sort of a feeling about how we might proceed for our next meeting? We could maybe take the old approach, which is we ask everybody to rank. I appreciate what Judy is saying. Are the results really as sort of clear and informative as we might think they would be? On the other hand, what I liked about ranking is it sort of forces every member to actually go back and look at it and ask a question if they don't understand. So we have a little bit better kind of collective consciousness about it. We could, if we did that, we submit it to Ellen, and then we come back and actually have a real discussion about what our priorities are. Or do we just pass on that and we take it up at the next meeting, and we just have more of an open roundtable discussion? That's what you're suggesting, right, Judy?
I'm suggesting that we, the working group,
Yep.
present a proposal to say, we think this is what the ranking should be, and then we try to reach consensus at the next school committee meeting. And then individual members can have time to ask questions of me or of Ellen before the meeting if you want clarification. And then we can also lay out some of our assumptions. Why are we, from our perspective, suggesting this ranking, so that we can look at our assumptions too. Because I think the thing that a number doesn't capture is why someone made a choice that.
Right.
And I'm not trying to set a process that's not inclusive of everybody and making sure everyone's voice is heard. It's just the math doesn't work. Depending on the number of projects you have and how many school committee members respond, trying to determine what a priority is, it gets muddy. It's not a good process. It's not enough people providing feedback to really give us a clear sense.
I would say, as someone who's been through the whole ranking process, that I don't think it would be a bad idea to try Judy's approach, because this is about buildings and conditions that the people on the ground are a lot closer to. And also, you go through this, and it's just kind of in alphabetical order, and you start to get depressed and give up the ghost before you even get to Morocco School. So I think it would be good for you to do, a recommendation and explain the thinking behind the recommendation, and then we could respond. I think that'd be fine.
Thank you.
I agree with Susan, I
Can I
think.
ask a question?
Oh, go ahead, Zena.
Go ahead, Zena.
I might have missed it, but is there a projection or an estimate of how much we can expect?
The magic 8 ball, yes.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So that, Zena, that can change year over year. And so I guess the short answer is, I want Brian to weigh in on this as well. I'm going to say the short answer is no, because we're not the only department looking for funding. So there could be a large unanticipated ask from police or fire, particularly on the DPW side, the engineering side. Water and sewer typically has its own funding source we don't typically have to compete with. But I actually brought to the table, so you can't appreciate this, my prop tonight. This is my binder for capital improvement requests, FY19 to FY23. It's probably 2.5 inches thick. It's this huge 3-ring binder from all the different departments. And so, I guess, so one issue is how much money will the funds actually have? But then the separate issue that we really have very little sort of clarity on is what are we, and I don't want to say this and come across wrong, what are we competing against? We do want to all work together and play in the sandbox, but at the end of the day, capital planning has to make some hard decisions, and we may have a very compelling case why we need to replace the rotting cabinets at Morocco because they're even worse than they were 4 years ago and they're pretty deplorable. And then, the fire chief lets you know something that's absolutely critical, and it's $200,000. Would you add anything to that, Brian?
I would just add that the capital planning committee, while they're ranking projects, health and safety generally is at the top of that list, followed by cost savings. So if there's a project that will change a boiler and will save us $50,000 a year, and the boiler costs $200,000, they'll say that's a good project. And that's one of the reasons why something like the Lincoln Playfield drainage site restoration, which is near and dear to my heart as a former Lincoln parent, still doesn't get funded because it's not a health and safety, and it doesn't show clear. It does show some cost avoidance, but not clear in the $93,000. So when the committee gets together, they're going to look at these projects in light of the other priorities, but those two priorities, and compare them with police and fire and DPW. But to second sort of answer your question, the total pot of money that's available for all the projects in town will be known. I don't know what it is offhand. It's on the order of $1.5 million ballpark. I think it was plus or minus, but that is for all projects in town. So we do know what the...
Yeah.
Yes, I
And
apologize.
that's total both funds.
That's total both fund.
That's not building and then another 1.5 for capital. That's total between the two funds.
It's actually slightly higher. I think it's more like about 1.6. But I was trying to round to a round number. So they'll go through. So when we talked about projects, for instance, the Morocco sink cabinet replacement, I actually really like the idea of, this is probably not what you're answering your question. I don't know if this is possible to call it $33,000 a year for 3 years. That's something that you can get more behind, because it leaves, if there's $1.6 million pot, and I'm making up that number, it's going to be something like that, then it's a small amount, and you can say, well, we can fund all these health and safety requirements and these cost savings and get some of the things we want to get done. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, I just was wondering also if they have like some kind of a tool where they track how much they spent on which project and what they project for this year. they don't kind of have a tool like that, do they?
There are two tools that are being used. Oh, I don't know. There's the VFA, which I don't think is what you were talking about. There's also a new program used, Facilities Dude, which is actually keeping track of the ongoing maintenance costs and projected maintenance costs. But you're referring to, I think, a past, like a fiscal year 18 project, and how much, I don't know what your question is, actually.
I'm more asking about like a predictive analytic tool, so something that looks at all the past data, looks at our town income, and kind of can predict what we're going to need.
So that's,
Future building, all of that.
That's a good question, and let's do that. Why don't we pick that up in the next agenda item, because we've actually begun to get into that as part of our kind of multi-year outlook discussion, Zena. So let's do that, because that is a good question.
But have we all come to agreement that we're gonna task the working group then with, that we're
Yeah,
gonna
is there-
change the process and we're gonna task the working group with coming back? Because from what I hear Susan saying, they're closer to the projects. Brian sits on Capitol, Ellen talks to Pete, that you guys would be a good resource to give us a rank list, and then we can talk about that rank list at the next meeting.
The only caveat to that, to me personally, is I'll be gone all next week, and we're meeting the following Tuesday. So,
Right.
and it's what day is today? Thursday. So we'd have to meet tomorrow or the following Monday. So, because the time is short.
Right.
So shall we try, we can try for that? You know, maybe if you guys focus on 2021,
Yeah.
do some work by phone, we could shoot for that. Zena, the one thing I was just gonna offer is when Brian, whether it's 1.5 or 1.6, we just bought a fire truck, was it last year, Brian? The year before? $660,000. So some of these are big expenses, and they cut the funding, you know, that really substantially depleted one of the two funds, you know, for a fiscal year. So I think there's some consensus, we can try it this way, Judy.
Yep.
Bring something back as a recommendation. I'm gonna move on to, so that was very lengthy, but I think it was very good to bring everybody, you know, up to speed as background. We will then pivot to the next item for discussion, which is FY '20, to provide us with an overview of our capital planning process and a review of, sorry, I'm reading this the wrong way. I need to jump ahead. FY '20 budget development and long-term budget planning, not really just focused on FY '20, but sort of multi-year. So in a moment, I'm going to put Susan on the spot maybe to talk a little bit about this as well, but there is a communications group that has been formed to really sort of think about how do we have a conversation as a community about our sort of long-term fiscal needs, both on the operating and capital side, to maintain kind of the level of municipal services that, and facilities that we've come to expect. And I think there's an appreciation that it's just not good enough, or it's not sort of good enough to say we need more money, or we need more money and this is how much it is, without kind of giving some context. So if there is a proposal for an override, which we know there will be, we've all been talking about this increasingly, what should that number be, and what are the consequences if it doesn't pass? And so a communications group was formed, I guess in the spring, Susan-ish.
Right.
So Susan's kind of started it off, right, on
Yep.
behalf of the schools. Do you want to just take a moment to describe kind of
Sure.
how that got started and work to date?
Well, it's really to help the finance committee, and it sort of grew out of their vetting and their committee report on the fiscal 19 budget, realizing that we are, and as it was, you know, articulated at Springtown meeting, we're really at a point where we are dipping into our non-recurring resources, our free cash, more than is sustainable, and we're going to need to increase the resources by raising taxes for our operating needs. And trying to just, this is now becoming an exercise in the Finance Committee, having people from the school department, the select board, planning board, come in and talk about what the needs are, so that they can really provide a kind of 5-year or 10-year analysis of what the needs will be, and project what the, the revenues we'll need to have to sustain those needs. So, from the school's point of view, we have, like when we do the budget, there are a number of components. There are contractual obligations, there are some improvements, program improvements we want to do. We also have, buildings with roofs and furniture and, technology. We want to talk, identify what we really need to maintain the quality of education in Winchester over the next 5 years, at least. And other, the town hall wants to do the same thing, and so, everyone needs to kind of be talking together and developing a projection and then a message. So we've kind of been looking at sort of 3 different scenarios. One scenario would be, and Judy can probably help me out here, sort of assuming that the funding just stays the same. If we don't have any kind of tax increase, what can we do with that amount of funding? And that will require some reduction in services.
Right.
So I guess we call that level funding.
That's right. Is that A? I think that's
Yeah.
A. Yes. Or you might call that the A for austerity. That's
Austerity.
Yes,
That's
that's
the word.
not level. We're not saying level service. We're saying
No.
level funding. So that's the tightest of the 3. Go ahead, Susan.
And then the sort of middle, the step up from that, from a cost perspective or a revenue perspective, would be sort of what we are doing now is going from year to year and dipping into free cash, but also making, the schools do get more of the budget, a bigger slice of the pie than general government does.
And we
So-
call that level services.
And that would be more like level services or sort of subsistence.
Mm-hmm.
We would, from year to year, be able to maintain some, basically the same level of quality, but really not, because if your enrollment is growing and you want to do things better or more innovatively, then you're just really not keeping up. So that's subsistence. And then the third scenario would be, let's look at what we really need to do, what the needs really are for our contractual obligations, and to keep our teachers and to retain, attract and retain motivated, skilled teachers, and make the program improvements that we need to do. And townwide, be sure we have enough public safety personnel, be sure we have the equipment that they need. That would be more like a, sustainable level of functioning. So that would, trying to identify what that would be and then project how much that would cost.
And so
That's what we're trying to, meet together and get input. The finance committee, this is really a finance committee's project, to recommend to the whole town what our town really needs to thrive, our growing town. And right now, they're trying to get input from various, other departments, including us. So that's what we wanted to talk about, get some input from all of you.
And so with respect to, just to be clear, someone, I think tongue-in-cheek, calls these 3 models faith, hope, and charity in reverse order. The austerity model, scenario A, would require cuts, layoffs, to just be very blunt about it, right? We're talking, and across different departments, wouldn't just be schools. On the scenario B side, which is kind of doing what we're doing, an interesting point that I think has been mutually agreed to is that, because we do generally get support from the finance committee on personal services to hire teachers and specialists with enrollment growth, the question was, so what are our assumptions about enrollment growth? Everyone around the table is saying we're using the master plan. That was developed, with Flansburgh. You've got the second opinion that concurs from Donahue Institute. So with respect to B, we would assume 16% enrollment growth over 10 years. So to Susan's point, we can't, when we talk about that 2.5% annual increase, the reality is not everybody gets that. We get a little more, some get a little less. So that's presumed to be in it. And again, just like we do today, There may be all sorts of initiatives. I mean, we talk about world language, right? And we do a study, and it comes in as a recommendation. But at the end of the day, the committee feels we can't afford it. I mean, that we'd be looking to continue that. 3 or 4 initiatives, we'd like to do them all. If we're lucky, we can afford one. So Zena, you'd asked, I think, a question a moment ago about maybe assumptions around revenue. And so that is something that a couple of members of the select board are working on with FinCom. In terms of state, what might we expect in state funding in these 3 different scenarios. With respect to the capital stuff, I mentioned earlier, it takes a vote of town meeting to redirect retiring debt back into these funds, and in the austerity model, it's assumed actually that does not happen. And the reason being that if that money was going into the general fund, that if we're really in an austerity model, there'll be something we actually need it for even worse. So it would certainly constrain capital. That's a good recap from Susan, kind of on these 3 different scenarios. We haven't really talked about what specifically is in scenario C, which is what kinds of projects, what kinds of initiatives that we would like to roll out. But that's a conversation to have that I would expect the committee and administration would have some strong opinions on, certainly. So in the packet that Judy and Frida have provided, there are some materials that Judy, I'll ask you or Ellen just to speak to.
Sure,
On
be happy to.
the operating side, and then once you do that, I'll spend a couple of minutes and kind of describe what this capital sheet is beginning to describe on page 12.
Thank you. One of the things that's very challenging about looking ahead 5 years to see what our needs will be is the assumptions that underlie that projection. And so we are at the beginning, both on the town side and on the school side, of negotiation of 3-year labor contracts. So we need to make assumptions about what the ratified contracts may look like in terms of compensation. We've got to look closely at the components of our staffing model, because we've got traditional, as every other school district has, step-in lane progression through the salary schedule. Teachers who are beginning teachers have larger increases built in than teachers who are at the high end, who only get a cost of living increase, if that's provided by the contract. Because we have grown rapidly, we have a large number of teachers who will have more accelerated increases than some other districts that have the vast majority of their teachers already at the top of the scale. And so we've got to look at those assumptions. And so the first sheet is Ellen and I started working on a sort of 5-6 year look in the past at what percentage of the town budget it has generally been coming from Chapter 70 and what percentage is coming from the town. Because I think you can't just make expense projections. You've got to have revenue assumptions underlying them. And the difference between the school department budget and the other town department budgets is that our ask for our total budget is only partially funded by town revenue. So we've got to look at what assumptions are coming in on the, will Chapter 70 continue to increase slightly? Will it increase dramatically? There are a lot of discussions now in the House and the Senate about a major change to the funding formula. We are right on the cusp of being a district that is going to get less Chapter 70 money because of our capacity to pay. So the state does an apples to apples comparison and says, here's what your property values are worth, here's what your incomes are, and this determines how much we expect you to pay for your schools. And because our property values are very high, our incomes, relatively speaking, are very high, I am concerned that the only thing that's kept us with pretty healthy Chapter 70 allocations and increases has been enrollment growth. And so those things all have to be taken into consideration, a lot of assumptions. Right. Because what we don't want to do is say to the town, we need to have an override, an operational override in order to fund basic operations, and then a year or 2 years later find that wasn't enough because of a change in the revenue forecast. So that's what that first page is. The second page looks at a couple of different scenarios in terms of what is our average increase in our budget. Our increase has typically been more in the 5% range, but to really meet need, we think it probably is looking more like the 7.5% range, particularly if we're going to provide for enrollment increase. And so that chart just starts to begin to quantify what would be the increase over the prior year if we made those assumptions.
Can I interject just a question? I'm sort of putting you on the spot. Are you prepared to say that 7.5 would correspond to like a scenario C, which we haven't totally really got into the ingredients in C?
This
Is that
doesn't
more like a
include new
B?
initiatives.
So this
That's
is
more
really,
like a B.
this is like a B.
It's our best guess.
Yeah.
Because a 5% budget, despite our best attempts, is a cut budget. And that's hard for people to understand. In order for me to present a budget to ask the town to fund that's at about 5% or 4.5% or 5.2%, we have to make cuts to make that happen. Not necessarily in personnel, although we really try to shift personnel and use them as efficiently as possible, but on the expense side. And so there are things that should be funded that aren't funded, and we all know what they are because we present them every year. It's not just new initiatives, or things that we defer purchasing. And some things that are funded through other sources, like Wi-Fi, funded, $1 million worth of technology. So that's just our best guess, but again, we're gonna dig a little deeper into this and see what is underlying. Some of that is a fairly healthy assumption around our contracts being settled.
And again, this is just, you're taking the information that we already have and extrapolating.
Right,
So
so
yeah.
that's what that is.
Math.
It's math, right.
If we do a 10-year look ahead on enrollment-related staffing needs, this is another best guess scenario because this is based on the master plan and the UMass verification of the enrollment projections. So the major enrollment increases are projected to happen in years 1 through 5, where we're looking for an additional 12 elementary classroom or the equivalent, 7 middle school or the equivalent, 9 high school or the equivalent. And you know that every classroom just doesn't come with one teacher.
Yeah.
It comes with support staff. It comes with other needs. And so we did our best guess and sort of estimated the increased staffing costs to be about $3 million in the first 5 years and an additional, what is it, 612,000 in the second 5 years. Just to sort of put a rough number out there to say, if these hold true, these are, and we were to maintain class size at the level it currently is, this is approximately what we would suggest it would cost.
Can I ask about an assumption with this one?
Yeah.
Sure.
Are these classroom sizes or these classroom increases taking 40B into account or not taking a 40B project into account?
Yes. Chris can speak to
Can you
this.
repeat that?
Sure. The question was, do the enrollment projections here take into account the likely 40B projects? Chris can speak to that.
So short answer is they do. So these are driven from the master plan, and there were multiple 40Bs we considered in terms of likelihood. So some in the first 5 years, others in the second 5 years. So yes.
So yes, not the highest possible number, but that sort of mid.
Right. Is there another, just going forward, not today, obviously, is there another chart we could see that if a 40B didn't come in the 5 years, how many classrooms we'd need then as well?
Just with existing students.
Yes.
Yeah, we could pull back that growth
Just out of
factor.
curiosity, so we could see how many.
Yeah, we can do that.
I should have thought of this before, but it just occurred to me to ask this, is this based on our existing teacher's contract salary schedule, or?
It's slightly higher than what we typically budget in. I think we, in the first 5 years, used a plug figure of 60,000, and in the second, I think we went 75. So we,
Well, like an average teacher salary?
it's the teacher, because we generally try to hire folks within their first 3 years of teaching. So we do master's step 3. So this is what we think master's step 3
Okay.
would be in the first 5 years or the second 5 years, best guess. Probably pretty
helpful.
conservative, but
Yep.
So some assumption for salary increase, but not based, but
Yes.
we're in the initial stages of bargaining, so
right.
Yep. That's
that
what I was
still
trying
has
to,
a long way to
that's
go.
trying to understand.
Yeah.
That's helpful, thank you.
I think we use 60 and 75 as the two numbers, and now we use 55 or so as ask the plug number.
2 questions.
Sure.
55,000.
Yes. Is typically what we budget now for new teachers.
These are all in current dollars?
Yes.
Okay. But year 6 through 10, we could easily just multiply out by 1.0x times
We could.
some exponent for those other years.
So Ellen and I did, put together these, obviously, how much work we're going to put into doing individual year kind of look aheads, and what is the increased cost in years thereafter after we've hired those folks. This was just sort of a down and dirty ballpark estimate, but I think we can certainly get more detailed and have the assumptions listed. We were just looking for a rough number. What would we expect? Close to $4 million for enrollment-related teachers, based on the estimates. But
I don't think you actually want to do all the
The detailed analysis.
No. Detailed analysis is fine. If you start doing too many assumptions, then you have too many footnotes. I would, if we're talking about this at a later date, have the assumption footnotes down below that say, we're assuming today's dollars, we're assuming today's salaries, and then just because you have 10 different people and they'll have 10 different assumptions they'd like to make for what year 7 is going to look like.
exactly.
Okay.
A lot of smart people who could put their heads on this and look at it
Yes.
20 different
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
So, the third page or third section is unmet initiatives. So these are the initiatives that we had already put forward multiple times, from many of them to previous school committee budget requests. They include world language expansion, continued very modest special education expansion and increased program offerings, additional professional development and teacher improvement support with coaches, the wellness ad at the high school, the additional adjustment counselors at the elementary school, staffing for a district-wide director of technology, which is a real void, in my opinion, in our
Yes.
structure, another instructional technology specialist at McCall, which doesn't currently have one, and then some improvement infrastructure and devices. You might remember we were building in replacement device funding into our budget on a kind of a very slow pace.
Right.
But this is for more innovative purchases. Full-day kindergarten aides, moving to full-time. And the last one is funding for a late bus, which is something that's been asked for. I didn't put that in my last budget, but, so I would characterize this list as very conservative.
Yeah.
Certainly, if the principals and I were to put our heads together, we could come up with many other initiatives that would be great to have and that other districts have. But I think this is the minimum list, and it comes out at about $3.2 million if we were to do it all in 1 year. So.
And so this, Judy, so this would be, some of this, as we continue to have this kind of multi-board discussion, some of this might fall into a B scenario. Any of it that doesn't or couldn't would automatically go into the C scenario, and there may be other stuff as well, right? In other words, this is sort of your first pass.
It is.
Would you sort of meet with leadership team in the context of other stuff that might kind of belong in a scenario C?
Yeah, I think so. And what is challenging about trying to come up with a list and even calling them unmet initiatives, some of these, including the special ed program improvement, is more like a mandate. But I just wanted to put a number on what we've been asking for that we haven't been able to fund. My concern always is when you're trying to describe what you're looking for in terms of resources to meet your minimal needs or to have some slight improvement, is that if the ask is too big, you could end up getting none of it. And really, so I'm balancing sort of building credibility, because I went before town meeting and I talked about nearly all of these things in multiple years. And this is what I think we need. These aren't even initiatives, these are needs, unmet needs. And so what you call them
I know.
is challenging. So I think that there are other things certainly that have been asked that haven't even made it to the budget request that I would consider needs as well. So this list could expand a bit. But I mainly wanted to put it in the book so that you could give me, if there's something on here that looks like it doesn't belong, that should fall off, or something major that should be here, that you communicate with me before the next meeting, and we'll
Okay.
continue to
All right.
update the list.
So what I like about how you describe this, Judy, is, and this needs to be clear in our messaging to the community, the message should not be, in the chair's opinion, if we had $1 million, this is how we would spend it. The message really ought to be, there's so many important things that we have discussed and vetted that we can't do, we haven't done, because we haven't had the $1 million. So, nice job in putting this together. Sounds like it may grow a little bit. We don't need to get into detailed discussion on it now. Again, it's just for the context of the committee. We'll turn to
I
page,
just want to ask one question.
yeah, go ahead, Zena.
On this unmet initiative, would it be wise to add all the fees that we charge students, like athletic fees, bus fees? Because I'm starting to hear a lot of grumbling about fees and equity of them, and I was wondering if it wouldn't be something we could also include.
I think, I can't speak for the rest of the committee. I can certainly, Ellen and I can put that together, how much we are reliant on fees to fund basic operations in a number of categories. And so at least it's important to identify how much of our budget is covered by fees. And if we were to have, in an ideal world, if this were Burlington, there would be no fees. Burlington has sufficient resources, right, not to charge fees.
And I think, Zena, where we will, in particular, I'm glad you asked that, because where we will need to discuss that would be kind of in the multi-board session, so everybody has a chance to kind of weigh in. It's fair to say, in scenario A, in the austerity model, either fees go up more and more regularly, or we cut programs because we don't raise the fees. In scenario B, the fees just kind of stay what they are, and maybe 3 or 4 years we revisit them. It's kind of what we do now, Zena, it's like, well, we haven't raised the athletic fee in 3 or 4 years, but now we need to do it. But that doesn't speak to your concern. So to your concern, and I hear the grumbling too, can we eliminate or reduce fees? That's very much a scenario C, discussion. But it would be helpful to kind of quantify that, to have that information at the table for sure.
We also think it's valuable to quantify what in a single document, we see it in multiple places over the year, but sort of what like WIFI and organizations like that are funding, that are donations to our budget, that I think they're things that our parents and the community assume that are paid for by the schools, but are in fact paid for by outside organizations.
Well, especially like extracurriculars, right?
Correct.
Where it's
Right.
100% funded.
Second that.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a good point.
Extracurriculars, yeah.
Right.
And it's a good thing about our community, our generosity, but also, I like that idea a lot because it supports what we're saying.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank
Good
you for
idea.
suggesting that.
So let me move on quickly to page 12 in the packet, because a part of our discussion is also about how we address our capital needs moving forward. So what I guess I would describe as, so I went back and looked at our updated VFA database, which I was describing earlier, Zena, that's maintained by a DPW and engineering. So this is a database, for instance, that says, Ambrose was built in 2004 and 2005. It's going to need some flooring replacement by year X. VO, you'll see on the list, VO and the high school are brand new schools. You would not expect anything to be critical. But in 10 years, some things will start to, wear out. So we're plugging in some numbers for that. So let me describe, I'll try to sort of move from left to right and characterize this in terms of scenarios A, B, and C. So the VFA database allows the town to tag items for their critical level for repair. So critical level 1 is something that most urgently needs to be addressed. It's in a failing state now, or on the verge of failure. So for instance, at Lynch, why is that number so high? That's the piping and heat distribution system we discussed on the last item in our meeting today. That's a boiler. That's the piping at Morocco. The tired original electrical system, that was put in 1966, and it's been patched together. So there are a number, and there's detail to back this up separately, Zena, but I've looked at this list with Pete, and certainly the items themselves that have been flagged as critical level 1 are all kind of legitimately important issues, which, by the way, we would assume we would tackle in 5 years. And that's how they're actually framed. That's the definition of critical level 1 is fix it now or in 5 years. And you see that there sort of at the bottom. I've totaled it up. It's almost $11 million worth of stuff. So to try to put it in the context of annual budgets and annual capital needs, it's $2.1, $2.2 million a year. Then you have another level, which we call urgent. So that's stuff that we can wait a little bit on, but also is in a state of just, it's old, it's beginning to show state of decay and so forth. Again, there's a whole list to sort of back this up. That comes in around 6 and spread out over 5 years, so that annual allotment comes down to 1.2. I don't think there's going to be a lot of adjustment in this. I will work with Pete just to see if there are some particular projects we need to adjust. I think I've already caught most of them. So for instance, at the Lincoln School, I think there was $500,000 in the VFA database to replace the fuel oil tank in the next 5 or 10 years. I took that out because town meeting has approved switching over to gas. So we're actually not going to use oil anymore. And I believe that tank, I think we heard from Susan, the tank's actually going to come out this summer. So we just need to be sure the VFA database is kind of caught up with current events. But that's kind of the level of scrub that I've been doing. So this would suggest like a scenario A. This is the critical stuff we need to be doing. And if we're not doing it, then we can identify the things that are only going to get older, fall into more disrepair, and with that comes risk. So the first 2 columns, I say, are relevant to the scenario A discussion. Then I'm going to move to the 3rd column, which says 10-year renewal. So the VFA database, again, based on like the age of a building, makes certain assumptions about when a floor should be replaced just on the general lifespan of the material, the building type in terms of, vinyl tile floor in an airport is going to hold up differently than it would in a classroom or in another sort of building. And so the same is true for ceiling, or for instance, are we painting walls every 5 years? Do we repaint every 8 or 10 years? And so there's some assumptions right out of the box that the VFA database uses to create these numbers. What you're seeing in that 3rd column, 10-year renewal, is sort of the unmodified. It's not been adjusted in any way. It's like if we spent the money on everything VFA flags, that's what it would be. That's a large number, as you can see.
This is all in current dollars, again, everything here?
Yes, actually, so Brian was asking about current dollars, so that's a good question. So in the 10-year renewal model, VFA would literally say, this ceiling in this building should be replaced in 2023. The cost for that there's like a 4.5% or there's some escalation factor that VFA builds in for literally each item. So if something is supposed to be replaced or renewed in 7 years, it has 7 years worth of escalation. If it's 3 years, it has 3. So yes, that in part is why the number is so big. But then when you actually kind of look through the projects and you kind of reflect on our current practices and frankly how we do take care of our buildings. I mean, our Lynch and Morocco are in sore need of replacement, but when MSBA walked through, one of the things the executive director commented on was he can tell there's some care and feeding about how we're trying to take care of the buildings we have. And so that was appreciated. That's true across the board. So this is where I'm going to do a little more work with Pete, but just making some conservative, or I'll say very realistic adjustments about things we really wouldn't need to do in the next 10 years. That number comes down sharply. So that column 10-year adjusted, I think probably could come down. I don't, right now it's at 6 million annually. I'd be surprised if it goes below 5, just based on, I don't think there's much fat left. But we're going to work on that. So the 10-year adjusted is what I would call scenario B. Then the VFA replacement column is just there for everybody's information. VFA, again, says based on the square footage of the building and all the stuff that's in it, if you replaced it, what would it cost? This is not a project cost estimate. It's more like a construction cost number, but it's not been prepared by a construction cost estimator. This is kind of a funky database that says all the stuff, if you had to buy it and put it in, should cost this. What's interesting about it is these numbers are actually not off by anything more than a factor of 2. I mean, look at the Lynch replacement, $42 million is not wildly off from what we have in the master plan when you consider this says replace the Lynch you have today. The master plan says you build a bigger Lynch. So it's not that far off.
So,
yeah, go
sorry, this VFA replacement column is of limited value because it's sort of not what you would really do in the real world, but it's useful as a check to give credibility to the master plan estimates.
Or yes, but even when you look to the left, Susan, so
Yeah.
for instance, if somebody says, well, what do you mean you need to spend, again, these numbers are going to be
Over
adjustable,
time,
but
yeah.
over time, you need to spend like 7 million at Ambrose. I think that number is going to come down, frankly, more towards 5 or 6. But, but what would it cost to just replace the whole building today? It just gives you
Yeah,
sort of a gut
okay.
check, if you
All
will.
right.
So, but yes, you can also use it as some frame of reference for the master plan,
Okay.
figures. So then the last comment I'm just going to make is, so scenario C, what does that have to do with capital? Here's where there's a little more of a disconnect, because what this chart simply says is we have some really kind of long-term goals towards replacing Lynch in Morocco. That will be expensive. That would require, we all appreciate, a debt exclusion override, right? So not really a scenario C funding model, it would be its own source. But I want to be very clear with everybody about what these numbers represent that are shaded. Why is Lynch 30,000,006 when I was just saying it'd be more than 42? So look at the notes. So master plan has a range of cost, but what I've done is I've assumed a 40% reimbursement rate from the MSBA. So those are nets that you see. Then the other point I would just make on the carriage house, so in here, again, it's been bumped up a little bit to 3.2 from 3.1. What is the value of the carriage house, just as a part of our, maybe, Brian, ongoing capital planning conversations? The carriage house project, as Susan and I were discussing this recently, we should maybe just kind of start talking about this more as central office relocation. Because the reason to do this is to get the heck out of this building, which could yield between 12 and 13 classrooms in a growing district where we would need the space, and or there may be revenue opportunity from collaboratives that have expressed some interest to Judy. So here's how I think about this, just orders of magnitude. For approximately 3.1 to 3.2, we're gaining 12 to 13 classrooms. An alternative, again, from the master plan, if we don't do that, look up a line. VO from the master plan is a more expensive expansion option. It's totally viable. However, it would take more time because it's an occupied school building. It would take at least 2 summers, plus minimal work during the school year. And it's only going to pick up 4 to 5 classrooms. So you think about bang for the buck, it's hard to even compare them. And again, we have a plug here for Parkhurst, which is, Michelle, not just the elevator, but there's some other minor work that would need to be done. So handrails need to be updated in the stairways, but it's really the elevator is the big part of the cost here. And the 11.7 I have on here is simply to reflect what we're already spending at McCall. So this is a first pass. As I said, I need to do some work with Pete on the 10-year numbers to come up with something that's a little more realistic.
So would you be looking for suggestions or, input from us about this so that it can, go back to the finance committee and so forth?
Yeah, so I think what I would like to do,
Maybe, some more footnotes, maybe fewer columns, something like that.
I think what I'd like to do, so eventually, yes, I want to spend some time with Pete on that 10-year number and then have that back up with me. I mean, it's a lot of information, so
Right.
maybe Susan, I could talk to Judy or Ellen about, do we scan that information, have it available on Google Drive, or how might we share it? Because, much like we just spent some time looking at just 3 pages of capital stuff, I mean, I probably have 60 or 70 pages of output from VFA, but I can imagine the school committee, would want to know, well, why is that number? Like, what kinds of things drive that? And I should be, we need to be prepared to talk about that.
Yeah, background information
The
is key.
background
Yeah.
information. So we just have to find a way to collect that and kind of get it to everybody, and then we could absolutely go through and have that conversation.
Right. So if I could just jump in, the challenging thing about trying to develop a plan to request additional funding to fund operations is that if you include capital in that plan, it makes the aspect of funding your regular operating budget more challenging because the ask is so large. And you can always do a debt exclusion override for capital projects, and you can't do it for operations. And so I think that the larger group, including the Finance Committee and the Select Board, is struggling with what should be bundled in this ask. I think the work Chris has done is really important because it quantifies sort of the global needs for each of our school buildings over the next 10 years, and whether, I like to say it all comes out of the same pocket. You've got to fund things one way or another. So the question for me, I think I've been pretty direct about this, I would not include capital purchases at all in a request for an operating override. I would strictly focus on operations, but that's a decision that the wider group has to make. And there are a lot of complexities in making that decision. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think I would not want to risk our operations because we put in something like a flood mitigation project in the overall ask that is not strictly part of operations, but is in fact a capital project. So.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, so on top of the schools, there's some major important capital projects.
Right.
Flood mitigation is at the top of a lot of people's lists. Zena, what were you going to say?
I was going to second Judy's comment because when I think of that $6 million figure for the 10-year per year, I think that will kill our chances for an operations override. And people are just going to misread it, misunderstand it, no matter how clearly we explain the funding. I think it's going to hurt us.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And so, what this is really trying to outline is what are the needs and what are the costs, and then what are they sort of spread out over a 5 or 10 year period of time. And it's starting to do that. I think we need to work on it. But to your point, even if that comes down to 5, that's still a huge number. So it may just drive. I mean, and it's going to be a part of this conversation, this multi-board conversation, that if it or a part of it is not part of an operating ask, then what? Because the pipes are only getting older, the boilers are only getting older, and there's some just significant, deferred maintenance or renewal or replacement costs that are not going to go away.
Yeah, I think it's easier to ask for those things, though, than it is for increasing teacher salaries, than it is for a foreign language program. I think people can understand facilities a little more concretely. So I love this information. I really appreciate all the work you've done. We're definitely going to need it moving forward. I would hesitate to include this chart and all of this information. I think it'll overwhelm the voters and they'll just shut us down.
Right. So this is really just for the benefit of this communications group that started. And then as members of the select board have been interested, they posted a meeting. That's why we want to do it that way for everybody here at the table, so more and more people can, see it and understand it. By the way, the other elephant in the room I should just point out is, look at the tremendous costs we're projecting for Lynch and Morocco. What would make that go away?
A new Lynch or Morocco.
A new Lynch or Morocco, or even a new combination school that would still have to be paid for, but through a debt exclusion override. We won't, again, just to remind people about the calendar, we might get some signal in late November, Judy, from
December.
senior staff at
Yep.
MSBA
Yeah.
on our SOI. Executive committee would vote in December. If they do pick us and we move forward, we would have to fund by the spring our share of a feasibility study, which would easily be on the order of $1 million.
At least.
Says Judy. So that's just another kind of unpredictable element in all of this.
And where does that come from?
Where does what come from?
The $1 million that you would have to.
Town meeting has
We have to, so what's required is either a special spring town meeting and a regular spring election ballot question, or a spring town meeting and a special election is required, and we have to vote the language from the MSBA to fund the feasibility study. That's what we've done in the past for the high school and VO. All right, Brian, did you have a
I'd add
question?
One more thing. I think it's important to include all these capital costs because someone looking at the 10-year look ahead and says we need 12 new elementary classrooms and
Where?
then 3 new, that's 15. The immediate next question is going to be, where are you going to put them? So if we don't have both, we don't actually have 15 new classrooms. We have, I don't know, maybe we can squeeze 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We certainly don't have room to squeeze 15 out of slicing rooms in pieces. So I think it's really important to have both halves of it. I'm a firm believer, personally, that when given all of the information, that the voters generally make the right decision. I realize we're just talking about the working group right now, but I think in the long run, people need to see that it's not just operating costs, that there are other costs, and they can weigh those costs when they look at it. And that's just the way I feel about these sort of things.
Well, and so I appreciate that. I know there's several folks who I think would be sympathetic to our sort of school committee policy around class size guidelines and would acknowledge the benefit that brings. But the question would be, do you have a plan? What is your plan? I appreciate you have a need. If you don't have a plan, or if you haven't articulated a plan on where to put these kids, why am I going to make this investment? We've heard that.
And
Yeah.
I think if we're going to use something like this and use these numbers, we just have to be also extraordinarily clear of where the numbers come from, what's included in it, how they were developed, so that they know that we're also not just pulling numbers out of the air, too. I mean, and this is just, just looking at what's here, and I realize this is an early draft. I'm looking at, the master plan build, for example, and it says 3.2 for the carriage house, and it says a 2.1 to a $3.1 million estimate. So that's only gone up 100,000, but you have VO going up 400,000 over what the master plan had. So why is it, and that's just one example that I see, just sort of scanning the sheet early and looking at it. And it's going to be things like that, to the point, we have a lot of smart people in town, we have a lot of mathematicians, we have a lot of finance people. We're going to need to be clear how we develop these numbers and where they came from, and if they're different than original estimates, why they've changed.
Yep. So, good point. And on that particular note, so they both got escalated because I think they were both in the master plan for FY18. The VO project was escalated a little more because it's actually a longer project. It requires you work for 2 years. So a lot of setup, takedown. It's an occupied building, so that really drives up, the cost
Right.
accordingly. But you're right. I mean, we have to footnote, including just everything where it comes from. I mean, the title up there says based on spring VFA reports, but anything for sort of public digestion,
Yep.
it's got to be clearer about. I agree with you completely. So this is really just sort of for the committee and for that working group. And again, as I said, I think some of these numbers will come down a little bit, but this is kind of generally how we've been structuring this.
Right.
And I'll work with Judy to figure out how we can, when we're ready to do that, have the background information ready. So these were two really, lengthy but helpful conversations on these two important points today. Moving on, we have some approval of minutes in the packet, if I may. We have minutes from May 18th. This was actually, I think, the joint meeting that we had with the select board. I was not present for that. There was some suggestion we might kind of go back and look at what the select board had, so I'll ask Judy to speak to that in a minute. And then June 21st from last week, I did have a couple of minor edits that I think have been incorporated at the table. And then Susan, did you have something
Yeah, I
as
had
well?
They've been
A
incorporated.
That's
few
been
edits,
picked up?
that's this separate
Yep.
copy.
Yep. Okay, so we have the update here at the table.
Does this have everything that both your edits and your edits?
I think it does,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, and my edits were just trying to clarify when we talk about public comment being included versus attached, body of minutes versus footnoted, so my issues have been picked up. But before we get to that, so Judy, where do we stand on the meetings on May 18th we had talked about last time?
So I reviewed the draft minutes for the Select Board's meeting of May 18th and added a little bit to the introductory section and then the list of participants on the Select Board side and clarified a couple of things in the information that Paul Manganaro had provided. The interesting thing about the Select Board minutes is that they don't capture any of the conversation. They just say that there was a discussion. And I think that's more typical of other board minutes. So there wasn't anything that I could add to this. These were all from my notes that I took when Mr. Manganaro spoke and tried to clear those up a little bit. So there isn't anything in addition except for the list of participants that is, comes from the select board minutes.
And you've added when the meeting was adjourned, so that's good.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think your bullet points are useful for somebody who, some details on the project itself, so. yeah.
Right.
I think it's really important. I actually am thrilled that you added who else was present at the table, because anybody at the table could have been part of that conversation and could have spoken
Yep,
up. So
true.
that's who had this conversation. So I think that's important to have.
So I don't know that we need to take these separately like we did the other day, so if
Okay.
I'd be happy to welcome a motion, if there is one, to approve the revised minutes as prepared for May 18th. That's in our packet, as well as the amended minutes for June 21st we have at the table with us today.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Hi.
You have to do a roll call.
Aye.
Oh, we
And
need
I'm
a roll
sorry,
call.
that's right, I have to do roll call. Zena?
Aye.
Susan?
Susan votes aye.
Brian votes aye.
I'll say aye.
Aye.
Aye for Michelle. Thank you, guys. Sorry about that. Thank you, Zena. Okay, so then we're going to move on to, I think it's FY 18. Or no, we have vote to declare surplus.
Surplus property.
Is that
The
what's
surplus, I
next?
think, is next.
Surplus is next. Ellen, you want to talk about this?
Certainly. So, John Allegretto, the network manager, has gone through the lower level here at Parkhurst and has identified technology equipment that has been put in storage here at Parkhurst that is either broken or has reached the end of its life. The technology is now obsolete, and there is of no value to these pieces of equipment. He has provided me with an inventory sheet which contains listings of examples of the technology, old projectors, old desktops, the power cords and power supplies for these items, printers, Chromebooks, things of that nature. He's gone through every piece of equipment downstairs, motherboards that are, like I said, broken, end of life. Technology is now obsolete. Programs are not supported anymore. So we are looking for the school committee to vote to declare this surplus property so we can dispose of it appropriately and have it removed from the downstairs. So it would be, John has been in contact with a company that he's dealt with before that recycles the items. So it would be a green way of taking care of disposing of the property. It would be of no cost to the district, and at the same time, we would not be receiving any money back to the general fund because
Yep.
it's of no value.
So just to clarify, this is primarily for technology, because there's a
It's
lot of
all-
furniture down there.
so
I
the-
think we've already
yeah.
discussed and in the
Right.
past voted to dispose
Right,
that too.
everything that is in the basement, in terms of furniture, was voted,
Yeah.
to be surplus previously. I have the listing of that. We are working right now to, once this is voted to be surplus, this will be removed first. And then we are also, been going through the furniture that is downstairs that was deemed surplus to see if I can pick through and find anything, that I can use in any of the classrooms. I've had some requests for, trapezoid-shaped tables and round tables. So
Yeah.
I'm going through and doing a final pick before things go.
So since if there are no, is there
I
a
have a
question
quick
for
question.
Ellen?
Go
Let me
ahead.
just grab
Go ahead,
the phone
Brian.
back. I have a question because I'm new. So if a projector breaks in a classroom, and somebody comes over and looks at it and it's broken, it actually comes here. It doesn't just get thrown away. So this is the collection of all the broken devices. Okay. The second part of that question only is
Only do those for toys.
hard drives. Hard drives are wiped
Every-
clean from these.
John Allegretto has assured me that he will make sure that all technology is wiped before it leaves the
Okay.
building. And this company also does the same thing. They wipe everything as
Excellent.
well.
Thank you.
So John has assured me.
Okay.
I was gonna ask the same question. No student data attached or
John has
anything to
assured me
this
that
device.
everything has been wiped, will be wiped, and he will provide me with in written documentation that anything that is leaving the building has been wiped.
Awesome.
So just one request for documentation is when we, for these minutes that Frida's taking, I think you said John's given you an inventory? Okay, great. So could we just maybe have that attached
I
or
will
something?
provide Frida
so we
with
have a
inventory.
record for what it is. So if no other questions, I'd welcome a motion for the committee to declare surplus property, damaged or obsolete technology held here at Parkhurst as described by Ellen.
So I move that we declare the surplus property presented by Ellen as presented, as I said. That's
Second.
not the greatest motion.
All in favor?
A roll call
Roll
vote.
call. Aye.
Brian says aye.
Aye. Zena?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will be gaining a lot of space back in the basement.
All right, and then now we get to FY18 budget transfers. Judy or Ellen, who would like to take this?
So Ellen's going to go through just in sort of general categories of transfers, and we'll be happy
Right.
to answer any specific questions. So just to remind everyone, the process that we're now using is to, during the school year, if we have an overrun on any specific account line, that we identify the source of funding for that, and that we periodically come to school committee to request budget transfers. So because a budget is done in November or December the year before, you often have slight differences once the year has started in what you really need. You might need more than you anticipated, you might need less. So just because there are transfers out of some accounts, it doesn't necessarily mean that there was any hardship associated with that. It could just mean it cost us less to purchase a textbook that we were planning to buy or some other materials. So Ellen's going to kind of talk in general about what the transfers for the last quarter are, that she's going to ask for your approval of, and she'd be happy to answer any questions about that. The next major shift we'll have is in the FY19 budget in the fall after we do our personnel hiring. This is primarily on the expense side, but some personnel. What we anticipate each building will need for personnel, the cost will vary, because if we have some teachers who leave or other employees who leave, they're replaced with teachers who are slightly higher cost or lower cost. It really does shift our personnel funding in the fall, but now we're doing this more regularly so we can keep a closer eye on our needs throughout the year. So that's what this is. So Ellen, you want to just run us through?
Certainly. I'm actually going to look at the FY18 budget summary, which is on page 33. And this will just gives a summary of budget categories, personnel and expense, where we are year to date with what we've been transferring. So when we look at central office for personnel totals, we have transferred out of central office to other lines within the budget, $80,187 in personnel. The bulk of this was due to, we had budgeted $140,000 for unspecified additions. That was step and lanes movement, and we were able to, due to budgeting and some savings, reallocate that money into areas that we had the need, which was primarily special education this year. And then when we also look through, again, there was salary savings across the board at different schools. And again, it was attributed to salary savings from hires, as well as Judy had mentioned, that when the budget was done a year ago for supplies and things of that nature. When we do look at technology, though, I do want to point out that with technology, we have only transferred out of technology in terms of personnel funding $8,736. That was savings that was attributed to, we did have a change in a network technician resigned. So we had some salary savings because that position went unfilled for a couple of months, as well as we had budgeted a flat amount for summer help, and the summer help did come in a little bit under budget as well. And the expense total of transferred out of $13,229 from technology, that was comprised of funds that were remaining in lines as we were approaching the end of the fiscal year. Auto allowance was paid for out of a different line than technology. It was paid out of the district-wide auto allowance line. Dues and professional development was also paid out of a district-wide line as well. And there had been some funding left in contracted services for technology that had been budgeted as in case there was a significant issue with network conditions over the year, that we would be able to increase the amount of the contract for the vendor that we have for contracted services, Phil.
So if I could just jump in on this, one of our major concerns was that we had put a hold on replacement technology purchases for students and teachers. We've restored all of that.
Right.
Funding, and have had a major purchase of Chromebooks and laptops, and we had replaced some projectors as well. And so I just wanted to be sure that people knew we were living up to our side of the bargain in terms of WIFI's expectation.
We did
that we
restore.
were going to expend from the technology replacement amount. The other thing I think it's important to note that we probably had not told you at the last meeting is that we will receive an increase in the circuit breaker
Right.
funding, and so
Gonna
Ellen
ask
can
that,
speak
yeah.
to that.
Right. So we did receive an additional allocation of circuit breaker funding. We had been funded at circuit breaker at 65%. We have been notified that funding has been increased to 72.10%, which gives us an additional amount of funding of $72,934 in circuit breaker funding. So that still is less than what initially had been projected, but it is significantly more than we have now. And that allocation of money allowed us to restore money into technology, as well as lessen the gap that we know that we are going to have for special education at the end of the year.
So related to this, can I also just ask, we set up at town meeting the Special Education Reserve Fund.
Correct.
What do we, and there was no real hard cutoff for June 30th for that. We have a little more flexibility time-wise. But given what you just shared with us, where do we stand on knowing if we need that transfer and needing to get that in front of the the select board?
So the final numbers aren't in yet. In the month of June, we had a number of unanticipated special education cost overruns related to placement of students in short-term evaluations, and some additional bills that came in that we had not anticipated related to transportation. The cost of special education transportation is pretty volatile, because if students are riding a bus to a placement, our provider can change the cost depending on how many other students are on that bus. And if other students no longer are on that bus, then our cost increases, which is difficult to manage and control, but that's the way special education transportation works. You can either project for the full year for a higher amount, or you can accept some volatility based on ridership, and that's the path we've chosen. We also had unanticipated legal expenses related to some employee matters, and also open meeting law responses, et cetera. So at this point, I anticipate we will need to tap into the special education reserve, but we don't know the amount at this point. But I'm hopeful that it will be not a substantial amount, but enough to ensure that we are at zero, for the FY18 budget, and that's really where we need to land. You see the projected balance in all of these accounts is zero. I do want to reiterate that we are returning the unused kindergarten funding to the town.
Right. The kindergarten funding was a separate, the comptroller and I did keep the funding separate from our budget from this year. So when you're looking at your budget report, the kindergarten funding is not included in there.
So probably, I would guess, if you're asking a timing question, at the July 24th school committee meeting, I'll have a request to access the reserve, and then we'll ask to have that placed on the next select board's agenda, and then you'll vote it as well, and then we'll close out, we hope, what has been a very, very challenging FY18 budget, and gladly roll into FY19.
So, clarification, we can do FY18, don't know what you call it, reconciliation after, it used to be, at FinCom, it was after 15th, I believe, and we had to do everything by the 15th of July.
Right,
Is
so,
that-
so I will know, by the 15th, pretty much, I will have a very good idea of what we will need to, where we will need to be, because all encumbrances have to be to town hall,
Yeah.
off of the, local operating budget. So I am planning on knowing knowing prior to the 15th, how much I'll have remaining in the operating budget to offset these costs, having encumbrances sent over, and then because the special education reserve fund is a revolving fund, essentially, Chris and I had a conversation with the comptroller regarding this, that we would be able to access the funds after
Okay.
6:30 for for July, FY18 invoices, as long as, again, vote from the school committee as well as the Board of
Okay,
Selectmen.
great, so we don't have to do this at our next meeting?
No.
Perfect,
I just want to make sure there are no unanticipated bills that come in.
Right.
that's
that-
better, if
Right.
you can, if you
Yes.
can,
Right,
yes.
and
That's why I'm so grateful that we have a more flexible reserve account now,
Yes.
that,
Right.
instead of going to town meeting to ask for it.
Right, and my office right now has, Catherine has been scrubbing purchase orders now for months, going back through, checking every single purchase order to make sure that if it could be closed out, and there's, dribs and drabs of money left over, that we're doing all those releases now, rather than waiting until, July 15th, that everything's being done in preparation of.
I'm sorry, was there anything else on this total in terms of transfers that,
No, I think that it's also important to note that as the fiscal year has progressed and the school year has been winding down, that we did have many leaves of absences in the schools. So there is transfer of funding around to take into consideration. Somebody was on a leave of absence that was paid. Their accrued time ended, so it became an unpaid leave of absence. Now we're shifting the funding around to pay for the long-term subs, as well as retirees for their buyback provisions that are in their contracts. So there's funding also for that.
Okay. So, the one overarching comment I would make, that I know I've made before, that I know why we're doing this, making these periodic adjustments, and I think over time I've become more and more comfortable with it and can appreciate why that's a good thing to do. But if I have any reservation, it's that, when we look back at a document like this, we see the original appropriation, we see the transfer, we see the revised budget. We know from our discussion this year, we had some overruns in special education. So if you go to page 34, you see those substantial numbers, 6 figures, starts with a 3. And Judy's always been kind of clear that there have been some adjustments made in other cost centers to help address what was, a higher than budgeted number. So some of these transfers, we cut in some places, to put it very bluntly, because we sort of had to, or made the decision that's what we had to do. But that's different than, for instance, an instructional supply line at VO. And so if Grant decides, that's more than I needed, that would be helpful, right, for the next fiscal year's budget planning. So something I'm just interested in, not that we need to talk about it now, but, moving forward, I'm interested if there's a way to identify in this document, or something, tagged to this document for, the next school committee's benefit when we budget for next year. I guess I'd like to avoid someone going back and say, well, this was our original appropriation, but the revised budget, we took 30 out, and then assume that's because we didn't need it.
Right.
And in fact, we did need it, there was something else we needed it for, even more importantly, and I know you all know that. On the administrative side, I just wonder how does a school committee know that, remember that? How does a finance committee know that? Because I would be concerned that these numbers might be misunderstood or misconstrued. Does that make sense?
Certainly.
right? I think it would be helpful if we're going to do this, and I hope we don't have to do it in the future, to cut into existing budget lines because we have to, because of cost overruns and other lines, is to summarize whether, I think in general, if there have been any cuts, it would be deferred purchases and not something that was planned to have been purchased, except for technology, which
did happen.
did happen, that we deferred purchases. I can't really identify any other lines where we cut something that was not already a savings. or something that, certainly we would have done more with professional development had we had more
I was
funding.
going to ask about professional development. Where is that? Is that just in expenses?
I'm sorry, can't hear.
Sorry.
Susan's asking
I
where is
would-
professional development?
Yes, that's what I was doing.
So professional development is the central, see, there's some professional development within
The
individual
detail?
school lines, but professional development is on, I think, page 22. What is it, under central office,
Under central office.
43,300
Okay.
is professional development.
Yes.
So one of the things I think we need to do a better job, and that Ellen is going to address, is how much of professional development is reimbursement for teachers taking courses, how much of professional development is workshops here, or courses that we offer.
Right.
There's some cost associated with professional development that is embedded in the salaries of the director of literacy and the new STEM director. So the costs for professional development go across a number of accounts, but Ellen, you want to speak to?
Right, and we also have the tuition line, which is the third line from the bottom, which is 94,000, and that is the line that the teacher reimbursements for coursework and for other staff comes out of as well. So moving forward into FY19, I have worked to kind of flush out the tuition reimbursement line. So there'll be 3 additional lines for summers, fall, and spring. So we'll be able to track more closely what the encumbrances and what the reimbursements are for each of those 3 time periods that are delineated in the teacher's contract.
And the professional development days that we have, you could consider the teacher salaries on those days an investment in professional
Correct.
development. The state considers it that. So I think maybe we haven't presented what the professional development budget is for the district, and I think that would be
Right.
helpful for people to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think maybe part of next year's budget planning, we can get in.
So just to clarify, this line that says professional development under central office
Yep.
at 43,000,
Yep.
that's the work that Jen does here in the office. That's not what necessarily each building then additionally has a professional development budget, or does this?
That takes care of the bulk.
Or
of
is
what goes
that
out. That
everything?
takes care of the
What's the
bulk
bulk
of
of
what
it?
goes out and goes on within the district.
Okay. So there's no separate line in
No,
each.
no.
So there's
School.
dues and memberships, which is, professional
Right.
development, under each school line. So that's partially that. I'm trying to think if the high school has a separate line for professional development, or do we tap into the district line? Have to look into that piece.
Okay.
So the bulk of our professional development in the entire town is 43,300.
Yes.
So, no, we spend about
I
a.
didn't hear that. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
so the question was, how much do we spend on professional development? So, the professional development so we have a number of people whose salary, is, partially, professional development is a major job responsibility, so the STEM coordinator, director of literacy. We are very fortunate in that we do a lot of professional development where our own staff members provide it for free. There's a curriculum development work where teachers get compensated hourly for extra work after school and in the summer. That's professional development.
And and that has its own line. That would be, when we look at the, top part of of page 22, there's, salary lines for in-service workshops and curriculum workshops.
Right.
Right.
And
That's what I saw
Okay, yeah.
first.
And how much is
Okay.
that?
116.5 was, the original appropriation for curriculum workshops, and, the original appropriation for in-service workshops was 42,000.
We also pay coordinators at the elementary level. We added grade level leaders. We added content kind of coordinators, teachers who provide professional development or coordination. So it's I think that the question is a great question, and I think we need a more sort of comprehensive understanding of what do we consider to be professional development, what goes into that, not just sort of any one line here.
Right.
But I think that's a good question. Is it enough? I think that one of the reasons Jen is not here today at this meeting is because she's providing
teaching.
professional
Correct.
development. She's
Professional
teaching.
development.
And Pam teaches, and I teach, and but Jen especially teaches, and so if we were to bring in outside providers, the average cost for an outside provider now could be about $2,000 per day. And so you can see what a great value we're getting from our professional staff members who are doing that in addition to all their regular jobs. And so, but it is something we need to pay closer attention to. So we'll talk about professional development spending and sort of maybe that becomes an additional area of need in the unmet needs over the
Yeah.
Right.
planning. So anything else on here before we ask for a vote on this one?
So we're looking for a vote to approve the FY18 budget transfers that Ellen has presented.
I move to approve the FY18 budget transfers as presented.
Second.
Okay, Susan,
Aye.
Brian,
Aye.
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 Zena?
Aye.
Unanimous, thank you.
Just still there.
Okay, so
Hanging in.
just chair report, in the interest of time, I will just say, again, thank you for everybody for being here, being flexible with schedules, and apologies to all the teenagers whose mornings were terribly interrupted so that we could all be here.
They're not awake yet.
I know that impacted several of us, and Zena, thank you very much for participating as well. Sorry we're interrupting your vacation. Judy, what do you have under superintendent report?
Very quickly, I sent out we have a lot of meetings in July. I sent out a list yesterday. If anyone has any
Helpful,
questions
yes.
about that, let me know. And everyone is welcome to any posted meeting. And so I just wanted to make sure that we are making an attempt to post subcommittee meetings and other meetings at which school committee members might be in attendance. So that's why there's a lengthy list. Parkhurst will be closed next week. And some members will be working at the high school. We'll put signs up. I'll send out some notifications. As part of the Great Parkhurst flood, we have to have the central flooring replaced, and it requires that we abate, and so we are closing down for the week for next week. Many of us will be on vacation. I will be on vacation, but certainly reachable. But others will be working at the high school,
I will be at the high school.
and Ellen will be at the high school.
And I gather from the photos I saw on Twitter, McCall graduation went off without a hitch. The weather cooperated. Was that
It was
nice?
beautiful.
It was a beautiful
It
night.
Absolutely beautiful night.
Thank you to Michelle and all these other people, I guess, who were setting up in advance for that. That's awesome. Weather always works for McCall. Doesn't
It
always work
does.
for the high school. I don't know why that is. I hope, knock on
Not
wood.
your year.
N=1, it hasn't worked for us at McCall, so.
Judy, I think we talked to registrar just before we get staff. Registrar will be at the high school next week?
Yes. Yes. So parents are encouraged to, if you have not already submitted your bus application, and also if people have not registered new students, they can go to the high school next week. And you can contact the registrar. She's listed on our website as well, and let her know that you'll be arriving. And there is a online registration packet. People hoping to register can get a head start. That's also on our website.
And if parents have questions about transportation, about buses, they would
They can
contact.
certainly email me. I am pleased that we have a new member of the business office staff
Oh.
started this past Monday.
Oh, good.
Marie Kelly is the new facilities and transportation coordinator. So she has been digging in and getting acclimated and trained on transportation. So she is processing all of the applications that have been received. So if people do have questions, please email myself or Marie Kelly. We will make sure that the website is updated to include her contact
Okay.
information. But I am on the website and happy to field any emails from parents or guardians that have concerns about transportation. And we will be at the high school Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday next week.
Okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Judy. So for future agenda items, we actually do have a few because they're slated for our meeting on the 10th. I think we've talked about an athletics report coming up. I might ask Judy, perhaps could Mark's presentation include just general sort of information for the school committee about our fundraising policies, maybe just talk a little bit about booster clubs, the roles they play. That might be a good sort of informative conversation, not about any particular sport, just in general, so we understand how that's supposed to work, how that is working. And also perhaps, Judy, what was your cutoff date for open enrollment? That's come and gone, right?
Yes. So
So maybe, I don't know if under superintendent report or in the next meeting, you want to summarize that for us?
Well, we have an enrollment update, so I'll give it to you at that point.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So next meeting is July 10th. I would think I was just looking as we were starting. I don't know that that's posted yet by the clerk.
Yeah.
It's a few days
She
away.
has just emailed me this morning and said that it's ready to be posted on
Great.
Monday on her return.
Very
It's out
good.
this week.
Thank you. Great. Okay. So, so Zena, we're just, that meeting, that's going to happen on the 10th. I don't think it's posted yet, but it's going to happen when the clerk gets back. But we're okay in terms of time.
I see it says 6 PM. Is that correct?
So, in my email, it said 6 PM?
In the packet for,
I think we
Oh.
had
Oh, I
talked
didn't
about
get that.
moving it to 6 PM if possible, but I am open to 6 or 7, whatever works.
just wanted to know, make sure we all knew what
News,
time it was,
news
so
to
we
me,
show up.
yeah.
Yeah.
6 is fine.
We're okay with 6.
Works for me.
Okay, good. So 6 PM on the 10th then.
We all show up an hour late.
Well, we could do 6, and
I say
since
that
we
now.
plowed through like the FY18 stuff today, that was good, because I just want to remind everybody, be thinking about, the FY19 piece. We have an $85,000 gap, and kind of reflect on our prior discussions about that, because we got to figure out what we want to do for the
We have a
coming school
plan.
year. All right, I know you do. Okay, so that, I think that's it. So happy to take a roll call vote to adjourn. Susan?
Aye.
Brian?
Aye.
Aye. Zena?
Aye.
And Michelle says aye. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned. Zena, enjoy the rest of your vacation.
Bye, Zena.